So just as we figured out how to measure production levels for the GDP, we now have to figure out how to measure price levels. Now, this is important because, as I had mentioned before, if we don't do that, we might get mistaken understanding of whether or not some of the increases we're seeing are increases in nominal values or whether they reflect an actual increase in production. We also have to think a little bit about how we do this, because when we were thinking about this issue in micro, we were looking at one market. So we were interested in the price of orange versus the price of apples. And then we would say, oh, apples became more expensive, let me buy more oranges. But there you're looking at relative prices where one price goes up, one price doesn't, and so on. And we know that in general, prices don't all maintain an exact same level and keep going up. Relative price differences are always there. But we are still interested in overall or aggregate price levels, because the overall price level is an important indicator of whether or not there has been a generalized increase or decrease in prices, right? So we have to figure out how to measure that, because we've got so many different things that we're measuring and producing, and we have to think about how we put that all together. So usually what we do when we measure is that we have to think about, okay, what am I measuring and why am I measuring it? All right? And so I'm going to start with the one that you are most familiar with. It's called the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index. So when I try and figure out price increases, I first have to sit and think about, why am I measuring this price increase? What am I trying to do? In this case, I'm measuring Consumer Price Index. I'm trying to think about whether the prices of the goods and services that consumers, ordinary everyday people buy, has gone up. And this is kind of important, because supposing my wages don't go up as fast, then, I might get a raise, but if the prices go up even faster, I might still not be able to get hold of stuff. And remember, the focus is stuff. So think of a city like Seattle, which is where we are, right? Your wages may go up, but if the housing prices go up even faster, right, in real terms, in terms of what you can actually afford, the stuff you can get from that wage has gone down, right? So you become really interested in price levels to figure that kind of stuff out. So the Consumer Price Index is one of the many indices, and once you get the idea of the CPI, you'll be able to get for most of them. What I do is I sit down and I take surveys. The government does this. They take fairly intense surveys. They survey people, what are you buying, where are you buying, and they come up with a representative basket of goods and services. So they come up with a list, okay, this is the kind of stuff, this is the basket of goods and services that people buy. It might include fuel, it might include medical bills, it might include rent, it might include, food, transport, whatever. And what I do is I take this representative basket and then I ask, how much did it cost me to buy it in year 1, say 1990. Then how much did it cost me to buy the same basket in year 2, say 1991, and so on. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a standard basket and I'm looking at how much does it cost me to buy this basket of commodities, year 1, year 2, year 3, and so on. And what I do is I usually take 1 year and I set that year to be my base year, or 100. All right. And so then if $100 in my base year can buy so much, then how much will it take me to buy the same stuff in year 2, year 3, year 4, and so on? So this is the way in which we measure the Consumer Price Index, which then means inflation is usually measured as the percentage change in the Consumer Price Index, or price level. So There are controversies about how this is measured because there are certain important elements to this, and there is a politics to this, just as there was sort of all these controversies about what does GDP do, what does it measure, what does it not measure. All right. So one thing to consider, for example, is there are debates about what should go into this basket of goods. Right. Some people might decide you should not include sort of transport beyond a certain level because even if it seems expensive, that's just a luxury or something like that, right? There might also be debates about whether it looks like it costs more, but it's actually reflecting an improved quality. So for example, it's true that if you bought an iPad or an iPhone, it costs more now, but some of that is an increase in the price and some of that is because it's a better phone, right? So there's going to be debates about to what extent are these price increases actual price increases? To what extent is this an actual increase in value and you have to reallocate that? There's also going to be concerns about whether or not the CPI is the best measure to use for everyone. So for example, certain segments of the population, the elderly for example, have much higher healthcare needs. So maybe a CPI that's just calculated on average for the whole country is not the best way to think about whether or not, say, retirement pension or plan is going to be adequate for them to meet their basket of goods. So students, for example, know that there is one particular good called education whose price has been going off the charts, right? Similarly, there are concerns about whether or not you should use the CPI for the whole country. No matter which area you're looking at, it's very clear that in some parts of the country, say urban areas, there are certain kinds of price pressures around, say, housing, which are not true in other parts of the country, right? So there are debates about how to use the CPI, how to adapt it, where it goes, what goods to include. There are debates about whether CPI underestimates the extent of price increase. For example, for some segments of the population like the elderly, because we haven't really given higher weight to health as we should. And then there are debates about whether the CPI overestimates the extent of price increase, say for things like iPods or iPads, where the price increase, part of it is because the value is better, right? But overall, there is a very substantial amount of work that goes into measurement, partly because large number of our plans rest on this. When you consider your future, if you do retirement planning, you worry about this. You want to make sure that prices don't go up so fast that whatever you plan disappears, right? We also know that inflation is not good for creditors, for example. It's better for debtors. So supposing I promise to pay you $10 as my interest. I borrowed money from you and I said, oh, I'll give you $10 interest 2 years from now. I gave you the $10 interest, except that by the time you got the $10 interest 2 years from now, that was hardly able to buy anything because the prices went up so fast, right? And so that means that that future interest payment's not going to be that valuable to you. Right? So there are financial market impacts because prices actually affect decision making that takes place through time. And here is the final thing to remember. We're going to come back to this, and they're going to come back to the extent to which so much of our decisions is not just about what I'm going to do right now, but about how what I'm doing right now will have some effect for me in the future. My savings, my retirement, whether I can go to college, what funds do I have? And those can very often be impacted by inflation and expectations of inflation, right? Just as increase in the price level looks like inflation, a decrease in the price level, which can also happen during the Great Depression, is called deflation. It might seem as if inflation's bad and deflation's good, because who doesn't like smaller prices? But it turns out this is not true. Because think about it as a firm. I just paid a lot of people, I produced a lot of stuff, and the prices just fell. It means the revenue I'm getting is not as much as what I thought I'd get. And I already had to pay all these people. I already had to absorb all those costs. Deflation is really not a good situation to be in, right? So overall, most economists look for a sort of healthy, slow, steady level of anticipated inflation. We'll talk about what some of these targets are and how they work when we come to policy issues later on. But in addition to the consumer price index, as you may imagine, there are other indices for which I will use different baskets of goods and services to measure price changes. So the GDP, remember, is not just what consumers buy, it's what all production, right? And so what we end up doing when it comes to the GDP is that we come up with a representative overall baskets of goods and services. And usually here, things like the value-added approach are pretty useful for figuring out what is a good representative basket of commodities for this economy in terms of overall production. And then after that, I do the same process. I measure how much would this basket of commodities have cost in this year, how much would it cost in that year, and so on. And the measure I get there is called the GDP deflator. This is like the consumer price index for the whole economy, right? And the GDP deflator is particularly used in order for me to convert real GDP to nominal GDP, right? And the book has some examples of the numerical ways to do that. We'll do some of those numbers and we'll do practice problems in class. But I want you to get the concept here. The GDP deflator then is what we use through an overall basket. There is also something called the producer's price index. So for example, if you've got an economy where you're quite heavily dependent on producing intermediate goods, mining and so on, or if you're a producer and you're trying to access inputs, you will similarly be interested in whether your input prices are going up and so on, and you might be interested in producer's price index, basket of average commodities used as inputs by producers, and then how does that price out. So all of these are different measures, whether it's consumer price index, producer's price index, GDP deflator, which we use for measuring different ways for different groups of people and different kinds of purposes prices can increase or decrease. So that is the way in which we think about price levels. And then we think of inflation as the percentage change in the price level.